This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 823 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the trends this week, I want to shout out the Late Round Fantasy Football newsletter. If you want my written content, aside from my draft guide and my prospect guide, that's where you can find it, and it's totally free. Just head to lateround.com, click newsletter, and subscribe. Now let's get to these 10 trends. Trend 1 this week is that Alexander Mattison saw a decline in usage. I had Cam Akers as a dart throw buy candidate a couple of weeks back, but then Alexander Mattison saw a jump in usage in week 6 against Chicago. But that jump came back down in week 7. Mattison saw his snap share go from 79% to 53%. He's now been below the 55% snap rate mark in 2 of his last 3. And in week 7, he saw his lowest running back rush share of the season at 44%. Cam Akers had more rushes than Alexander Mattison had. If Akers is still on your waiver wire, he should be added. He just was rostered in too many leagues for me to recommend that on the 15 Transaction Show this week. Speaking of the Vikings, I talked about this before, but the trend just keeps continuing. The Vikings currently have 16 offensive touchdowns, and all 16 of those scores have come via the pass. It's absolutely wild. That type of number regresses. That's not going to keep up. And when it does regress, it'll make Kirk Cousins a slightly less viable fantasy option. Now, fortunately, the Vikings are a pass-heavy team, so their rate of scoring passing touchdowns is going to be higher than the league average. It's just not going to be this high. Okay, I've got one more Vikings trend for you this week. Justin Jefferson's now been sidelined for 2 games. In those 2 games, TJ Hockenson has averaged a target share per game rate of 27.3%. Before that Jefferson injury, his target share per game was 19.2%. I made the comparison the other night on Twitter, but Hawkinson's essentially the tight end version of Alvin Kamara right now. He gets low average depth of target dump-offs, which are basically a cheat code in PPR formats. As long as Jefferson's out, those are going to continue coming his way at a high rate. During the Chicago Bears' first 4 games this year, they ranked 2nd in total touchdowns allowed defensively, they were 32nd in sack rate, and they were dead last in passing EPA per dropback allowed. But that Bears defense isn't the cakewalk matchup that it once was. Over their last 3 games, they're 20th in offensive touchdowns allowed, and they're 10th best in passing EPA per dropback allowed. Now, they faced relatively easy competition against the Commanders, Vikings, and Raiders. But it's something to keep in mind when you're using players against the Bears. The matchup probably isn't as easy as it looks on paper. The Saints are using Taysom Hill more as a traditional tight end. He saw a 17% target share in week 6. He followed that up this past week with a 9.4% target share. His route participation over his last 2 games have been 62% and 71%. His previous season high was 43%. That's making him very viable in fantasy football, because not only does he have some reception viability now, but we know the touchdown upside is there given how they've used him historically at the goal line. According to FantasyLife.com's data, and I say this each time that I reference that site, but this is absolutely free, you guys. You should check it out. But according to Fantasy Life, Christian McCaffrey is tied for the league lead right now in route participation with one other running back. That one other running back is not Bijan Robinson. It's not Travis Etienne. It's not Kyron Williams. It's Rachaad White. Now, White hasn't had the best season in the world from a fantasy perspective. He's kind of just been fine. But he's seen a double-digit percentage target share in each of his last 5 games. And Tampa Bay running backs have faced the toughest schedule in the league thus far in adjusted fantasy points allowed. The schedule does open up for him moving forward, so I'm optimistic. Now, another player that I liked pre-draft, Drake London. He saw 1 target and he didn't catch a pass in week 1. Since then, though, he's averaged a 24.3% target share per game rate. He's averaged 13.9 PPR points per game. That PPR points per game rate since week 1, it ranks as a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. And he's done that with just 2 receiving touchdowns. He's not doing anything special in the touchdown department. Considering their schedule, I'd look at London more as a buy than a sell right now. A player who's really balling out recently is Darren Waller. He started the year with PPR finishes at tight end of tight end 18, tight end 4, tight end 25, and tight end 26. Over his last 3, he's been tight end 7, 13, and 2. He's averaged almost a 30% target share over his last 3 games. That's really keeping him elevated because the Giants' offense is not good. But because of those target shares and the way that Darren Waller's trending, he's a must-start moving forward. It's been a rough year for Devontae Smith. He's seen a target share of 22%, which really isn't that bad, but he's just not converting. He's now scored fewer than 10 PPR points in 4 of his 7 games this year. In 2022, that happened 5 times in 17 games. You likely have to start him, and he's got a great matchup this week against Washington. But it has not been easy. The last trend this week is about the really obnoxious Arizona Cardinals backfield. Everyone spent up on Amari DiMercato a couple of weeks back. And then we all watched a split backfield for Arizona. But in week 7, DiMercato had the role that a lot of people thought that he might have when James Conner went down. He ended up playing 78% of Arizona's snaps, and he had a bell cow workload. He saw 93% of their running back rushes, and he had a 15% target share. If that continues, there's going to be plenty of usability. Just be aware they can change things in an instant. After all, that's what they did from week 6 to week 7. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Also, remember there is a Late Round Fantasy Football Instagram account. You can check that out at LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Sleeper Show.